In this video, I would like to talk to you about Blake's poem London from the Songs of Experience from 1794. This video is aimed at students studying London as part of their A-level qualification, but it might also be useful for students studying other courses and qualifications as well. So hopefully this video would be useful to you. Let's just start with a summary of the poem, and it's a simple concept. We have a speaker who is wandering through the city streets, and as he walks, he notices suffering all around. Those on the streets have lost their innocence, and we are particularly interested in the depiction of three of the figures, which is a prostitute, a soldier, and a chimney sweep. And through those characters, Blake, or the speaker, is promoting or presenting the message that the city represents a debauched and dystopian existence, which is often seen as being at odds with the bucolic and harmonious depiction of the green world seen in many of the Innocence poems, for example. Rousseau believed that cities have filthy morals, which is at odds with a sense of naturalism, and therefore that binary between the city and the country is reinforced through some of the philosophical thinking at the time. Let's just understand, before we look at the poem itself, what London was at the time. So Blake said himself once that London was golden, with her silver Thames thronged with shining spires and corded ships. But London began to change quite rapidly around the time of the French Revolution. Firstly, the atmosphere of the place started to change because of the French Revolution and how the UK government became increasingly reactionary and dogmatic in order to reduce the likelihood that a similar revolution would take place on British shores. So they were looking across the Channel and were worried that they would also be overthrown in the British Isles. So that was one of the kind of the mindset changes, the psychological changes. But also London began to change because of the Industrial Revolution. And it went from a small hamlet, let's say, of farmland along the banks of the River Thames to a pinnacle of industrial and technological advancement, and also the centre of Western civilization. So the poem demonstrates that Blake is a social commentator because of the fact that he's using this city as a springboard to debate and present the themes of suffering and poverty and unfairness, and also exposing the gap between rich and poor. Look out for the capitalisation in the poem. Palace, soldier, infant, chimney sweep, harlot are all capitalised because those objects or those people represent a much broader issue. So the harlot represents prostitution and women's rights, for example. The infant or chimney sweep represents the corruption of innocence or child labour. Palace represents royalty and the monarchy, and so on. So that's why they're capitalised. So perhaps you could argue that Blake is using this poem and saying, look, this is what's wrong with London. This is what's wrong with civilization at the moment. Perhaps we need another revolution here in order to eradicate this kind of dystopia and bring about a sense of equality, similar to the ethos of the French Revolution. In terms of London itself, by the end of the 18th century, London was the largest and most diverse city in the world in terms of population. You had the slums in the east and the aristocrats in the west. And this was also a time of empire, the growing empire, and London, of course, was the centre of that as well. By Blake's death in 1827, 2 million people lived in London, which was a lot considering that London was a lot smaller then than it is now. So you had urban sprawl in contrast to the farmland and the bucolic depiction of the countryside that you would have had previously. In 1774, you had the London Building Act, before which many homes were constructed in a very substandard, poor way, and in fact many of them fell down. And of course, the people that lived in those houses that fell down were often the poorer rungs of society. Those people moved to London because they had factories there and they had work there, and these factories needed a workforce. But they often lived in poor accommodation, whereas the people in the West continued to live in relative luxury, where the wealth was. And at this point, I often ask my students to think about the Grenfell Tower disaster. and about how that tower was in one of the richer boroughs of London, even in the 21st century. And yet one of the reasons why that building had substandard fire safety was because the people that lived there were poorer. So even today we have cities, not just in London but across the world, where you have rich and poor cohabiting a particular city. So it's nothing new. And therefore, that's perhaps where this poem's relevance comes from to us today, because it's talking about the same idea of that binary between rich and poor. The poem has 4 stanzas, and it has a number of quotes in it that students often over the years have referred to, such as the charted streets, the charted Thames, mind-forged manacles, the blackening church. So there's lots of key quotes in this poem that students often want to refer to. If we look at the first stanza, we have a first-person speaker, homodiegetic perspective, which makes this poem seem a bit like a monologue. As the speaker journeys through the streets, he basically writes down and thinks about what he's seeing and the implications of what he's seeing as well. You've got the repetition of that verb chartered, or adjective chartered. And a charter is established by means of a grant from a wealthy company or individual, suggesting that somebody owns a particular district, let's say, of something. And here, for example, it reinforces the fact that London is not a place of freedom, but it's a place of ownership and a place of restriction and restraint. Even the Thames, which you think nothing can stop a river flowing, even the Thames is charted, suggesting that even it cannot flow freely through the city. We've got a lot of the repetition of the adverb every in this poem, not just in this stanza but in the second stanza as well, suggesting that the suffering is everywhere. And you've also got the alliteration there of weakness and woe, suggesting the plight of the population, full of disease, poverty, in this kind of tyrannical, authoritarian, dystopian place. But the suffering is both physical, but also mental, and that is reinforced through the quote in the second stanza of the mind-forged manacles. As we move into the second stanza, you have more key imagery, really. You have the anaphora of every, so again, that all-consuming sense of suffering that affects everybody, right from man, as in older people, right down to infants. You've also got that key quote here of mind-forged manacles. And those manacles are old-fashioned handcuffs or shackles that would be used to fasten around often convicts, prisoners' legs and feet in order to stop them escaping. So Blake, at the time, would have been probably quite used to seeing in the end of the 18th century convicts being sent to Australia, and they would board ships wearing these manacles. So it's again clearly a metaphor for restraint and control. But notice that these manacles are mind forged; they are psychological, and that suggests that the society that these people are living in forces them to impose this restraint on themselves, because that's basically what they've just learned to do. So they naturally reflect the society in which they live in, because of the imposition of rules and lack of freedom on them. And in 1792, Rousseau mentioned that man is born free, but everywhere is found in chains, from the social contract. So again, those chains clearly a metaphor for that control and that sense of restriction. This is not a city which is offering a utopian life. As we move into the third stanza, you have the chimney sweepers being referenced, and of course we have 2 separate poems for them, one in Innocence and one in Experience, so I would suggest go back and look at those videos to understand the context there. But of course chimney sweepers were often orphans, they were often in the care of the church, and of course the church is doing very little to protect them or look after them. They are in fact exploited. The fact that the church is described as blackening suggests that it is covered in a metaphorical shame. It might be dirty because of all the smog and the soot and the pollution, but it's also metaphorically shamed here, and the speaker is appalled, for example, that this symbol of religion, holiness and divinity is actually being used as a symbol of corruption and amoral behaviour, because the church is failing to protect the most vulnerable. So there's also a sense of hopelessness and dismay here, that even if the church can't help, what on earth will help? And you also, in this third stanza, have the image of the blood running down palace walls, which some say might reference the French Revolution, and perhaps the storming of the Bastille, for example. But also it could be seen as an attack of the monarchy, and the idea that those in power don't fight their own wars, they get soldiers to do the fighting for them. And that's obviously still the case, unfortunately, today. So the soldiers are very much at the mercy of their superiors. So Blake is probably also, through the capitalisation of the palace, condemning royalty and the monarchy and the aristocracy for again failing to protect soldiers who are perhaps being manipulated by the state, being told that they need to go and fight for, to protect their homeland, but actually that those wars might just be as a result of the ego of the people that are telling them to go to war. So the Blood Down Palace Wars again shows that binary between the rich and poor. The rich behind palace walls, quite protected in luxury, and how they are protected by the blood, by the war, by the soldiers who are doing all the fighting and being affected negatively by it. And finally, in the last stanza, the main image here is of the prostitute, the harlot. And the prostitute is described as youthful, suggesting that she's not very old. And she also has a newborn child who she is cursing or blasting, suggesting that she's actually venting her frustration of her life to this innocent, defenceless child, which is quite an emotive image, really. Of course, at this time, women had less rights than men, and one of the few things that women had to sell was their body for sex work, and that's clearly what's happening here. So society has not only just failed the soldiers and the chimney sweeps and the infants, but it's also failing the prostitutes as well, who have no choice but to do this work in order to make ends meet. Of course, medical advancement at the time was not great. They did not know about sexually transmitted diseases or infections. So with this kind of work, you have plagues, suggesting perhaps disease and STIs. But perhaps the reason why Blake is also using the oxymoron marriage hearse is suggesting that he's seeing marriage as restrictive, that marriage is becoming almost a form of perhaps legalised restriction, or perhaps a form of legalised prostitution. Hearse, of course, has connotations of death and decay, whereas marriage is much more positive, with things like wedging carriages, for example. So the two are at odds here. Not a great depiction of the plight of women in the city. And finally, whenever you have reference to midnight or night in Blake, you know that that's going to be used as a metaphor for something. And here it's the metaphor of fear, of darkness and danger, vulnerability, of menace that seem to exist on the streets, mainly perhaps at night time, but also just consistently. So there's a degree of pathetic fallacy there as well, this kind of sense of darkness and decay. Whereas you have, for example, in other Innocence poems where you have the sense that morning is going to follow night and you've got that sense of renewal, here, of course, it's much more bleak, and it suggests that suffering is not going to end and it's just going to continue. So that is the poem London by William Blake, not just used here for A-level students perhaps, but perhaps useful for those of you studying GCSE as well, because I know that poem comes up in one of the poetry clusters, or just anybody generally who's interested in Blake's poem London. So hopefully that has been helpful.